My name is John Gardella. I see a lot of familiar faces, and believe me, I'm so happy to see so many people here. I thank you for coming. There's also some new people, so I'll introduce myself. I've been giving lectures here for about almost 7 years, history lectures on and off. And I'm a retired high school teacher, okay? I taught AP World History and AP United States Government and Politics. I'm not a professor. I'm not an expert on Ukraine or anything else, really. So bear with me. I'm not a linguist, so some of my pronunciations are off. I do have a bit of a background in Russian history. That was my emphasis in college. I was in Russia in March of 1990 when Gorbachev announced the end of the Cold War. So I'd experienced that, and I've had a lot of interest in Russia and extension Ukraine over the years. So any mistakes are my own that are up there, and I apologize, and there are probably some. My mother, Frances Gardella, who just turned 97 this week, I introduced her because she usually points out my mistakes when I get home. And my projectionist or technical wizard over here, my wife Jana, who's a retired teacher, and the only reason I was a successful teacher is because I was married to her and she made me do things, do them right. For those of you who've been coming for a while, you'll be happy to know she baked. Okay, so which is a tradition, and she baked some Ukrainian cookies. So we'll take an intermission at some point. Okay. Very good. So let's get started. So this is I titled this is a brief history of Ukraine and then the events leading to the Russian invasion. After you see it, you're going to be saying, this isn't so brief, but I'll do the best I can to get through it. If you have questions, I may be able to answer them. I'll try. So we'll go with that. So, an agenda, I always have an essential question. I have two of them right now, and I want to start off by saying I'm not an apologist for Russia, and I'm not an apologist certainly for Vladimir Putin, okay? But it is a very intertwined history of Ukraine and Russia, okay? So the first question is, given Ukraine's history, does Russia have any legitimate claims on Ukraine? Okay, certainly not an invasion and violence and everything else going with it. The second question is, what should the United States and its Western allies do about the Russia-Ukraine war and Vladimir Putin? We'll discuss those at the end, and if you have any questions. What we're going to be covering, I'm going to do a brief introduction and background, talk about the early history, the Kievan Rus, the rise of Moscow, Imperial Russia, wars and partition, the rise of nationalism, the Great War, communism, the Soviet Union, Ukraine under Stalin, World War II and its aftermath, Gorbachev's reforms, independence, economic and political instability, Putin, Russia interference in war, and then we'll have our discussion. The glory and freedom of Ukraine has not yet perished, is the opening line of the Ukrainian national anthem. And it was officially adopted, I believe, in 1992, but its origins go back to at least the early 1920s, okay? And it's moving, and you see these people singing the national anthem, and children singing it, and and orchestras playing it, and how meaningful this is to them. My main source for this lecture was The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine by Serhiy Plotky. I probably destroyed his name. He's a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard. And the second edition came out in May 2021. And then when we get in towards the war and the events leading up to the war, I have another source I'll talk about. I used other sources, but this was my main source. Okay, so two maps. The first map is just a general map of Ukraine, and we're going to see as we go through this, the maps of Ukraine change all the time. I mean, it's unbelievable, the expansion and contraction of Ukraine. But on the right, it's kind of interesting because it overlays Ukraine over a map of, eastern United States. And you can see how large it is, right? It goes from Toronto down to Virginia or even into North Carolina, if you count Crimea, and from New York to Chicago. So this is a big area. It's a large country. Okay. Another map of Ukraine. I showed you where Kiev is, and you've certainly seen probably lots of maps on the news over the last few months. The separatist-controlled area, which is part of the Donbass, which we'll talk about later, and then Crimea annexed by Russia in 2014, just so you see where that is. You see where the Black Sea is down at the bottom, and the Sea of Azov is just to the right of Crimea. The Caspian is off further east, which is not on the map. Okay, why is Ukraine important? That's a good question to ask. It's the largest of the post-Soviet republic after Russia. Okay, so it's a large place, as I had mentioned. It has or had a population of 44 million. It gained its independence in 1991 and has maintained democratic institutions, though obviously with a lot of challenges that we'll talk about. And it's tried to orient itself most of the time towards the West. And by the West, I mean Western Europe, the United States. Ukraine has been a center of struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. And of course, we see that play out now every day in the news. It's located at the western edge of the Eurasian steppe and is a gateway to Europe. It's helped stop invasions both east and west. It's been a bridge between Europe and Asia, acting as a meeting place and battleground for various empires, including the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg, and the Romanov. It's been ruled by St. Petersburg, Vienna, Warsaw, and Istanbul, to name a few. And each has left a mark on Ukraine. You can see the ethnic breakdown. This is from 2001. Almost 78% Ukrainian and 17% Russian. And then various others. Okay. The ethno linguistic map of Ukraine. So the red and the pink, the red is mostly Ukrainian speaking, and the pink is predominantly Ukrainian speaking. The yellows and yellow shades are mostly Russian speaking and predominantly Russian speaking. Okay. People of Ukraine. It's a multi-ethnic, multicultural country. Most of the people, the Ukrainians, are Slavic in origin. The Slavs are a conglomerate of tribes that came, 8,000 years ago, I mean, a long time ago, came into Eastern Europe at that time. The Slavs speak a variety of Slavic languages that have origins in Indo-European languages. And today, people will refer to the East Slavs, which are Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians. And then you see also West Slavs and South Slavs. Introduction and background. It was first settled about 45,000 years ago by Neanderthal hunters. And when I took my DNA with the National Geographic, I don't know if I was proud to say, but they told me I was 5% Neanderthal, which my sister had been telling me for years. So I wasn't surprised. Of course, it meant she was too. But anyways, obviously hunters and gatherers, and 5,000 years ago, humans come in and they begin to settle in the 4 steppe lands and engage in animal husbandry and agriculture, which is, of course, a pre-civilization thing where people stop hunting and gathering. 3,500 years ago, they domesticated the horse, and that's going to be an important part of Ukrainian history. And, of course, the Indo-European languages, which I had met. In 512, before the Common Era, or BC, as we used to say, Herodotus, the Greek historian, was the first historian to write about the area, which was called the Pontic Step. And he talked about it as a land of savages and a playground of the gods. The Scythians created an early civilization and traded with the Greeks. In the 3rd century BC, they were replaced by the Sarmatians, who were of Iranian stock and were referred to as barbarians, the Romans. About 100 after the Common Era, or AD, the Romans identified the Don River, which is east of Ukraine, as the eastern border of Europe, placing Ukraine on the European side, okay? And it might not sound important, but it's kind of interesting because when we're talking about Eurasia, where do you fit, where do you belong? And that's really a lot of the discussion on Ukraine. The Pontic Step, so you can see in the map, if you find the Black Sea in the middle, the whatever that color is, purple, I guess, and then a photograph actually of the Pontic Step, these vast grasslands, and that's actually a national park where that photograph came from. The early history, 250 to 900, the Goths, who, you've probably heard about, defeated the Sarmatians and ruled Ukraine. Between 375 and 650, there's a period of migration, so people are moving through Ukraine, the Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars, across the steppes on their way to attack the Roman Empire. Okay, so you've heard the Roman Empire is brought down by barbarians. These are the folks. 1838, the first mention in the ancient chronicle. Now, the ancient chronicle was written around 1000 AD, and it was sort of the first history of Russia and Ukraine in the area. And they mention a Viking by the name of Rurik. Now, we've seen all these groups migrating through the Pontic Step, through Ukraine, harassing the people, the settlers, the Slavs who were living in Ukraine. So they asked this Viking prince, Rurik, if he'll stay and rule over them and protect them, and he agrees to. So it becomes known as Kievan Rus, which is what it's going to be called for several hundred years. Originally, they were attacking Constantinople, which is the capital of the Byzantine Empire. But then eventually they began to trade. Now, Prince Vladimir of Ludmil, if you say it in Ukrainian, it's Vladimir in Russian, the Great, adopts the Eastern Orthodoxy for himself and his people. Now, he went out and shopped religions, okay? He felt that a religion would really bind the people together. So he sent representatives off to Rome, and they came back and they said, well, the Roman Catholic religion's a good religion, but you have to pay homage to the Pope. I don't want to do that. So they looked at Islam, and they said, Islam's a great religion, but you can't drink. Okay, so that was out. So the Byzantine or Constantinople religion, which was the Eastern Christian church, if you remember Constantine promises when he's in this big battle around 450, and he says, God, if you save me, I'll go find a new home for the Christian religion and protect it. So he goes into Constantinople and sets up a religion. The thing that they liked, or Vladimir liked about this religion, is that the political ruler was also the head of the church. Okay, so they could support them. 1037, Prince Yaroslav the Wise completes the construction of St. Sophia Cathedral, and it became the seat of the Metropolitan, which is the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the site of the first Rus library. Ukraine was the center of the first Eastern Slavic state, the Kievan Rus, which during the 10th and 11th centuries was actually the most powerful political power in Europe. In 1187, the Kievan Chronicle, which I mentioned, first uses the word Ukraine. So that's when that word first comes into play. And it means the borderland or outskirts of the Kievan Rus. The Grand Duchy of Moscow. So Moscow was first mentioned in 1147, and it's a small town on the Moscow River in the Vladimir Suzdal Principality. Vladimir and Suzdal are about 100 miles east of Moscow. It was a fortified town with a wooden fence that grew into the Grand Duchy, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. In 1240, the Mongols, led by Batu Khan, who was Genghis Khan's grandson, came in and destroyed the city and killed the inhabitants. But they're only interested in tribute. So when Mongols came around, they'd come up to a town and they'd say, if you surrender immediately, we won't kill you. You can just pay us tribute. But if you don't, we're going to kill everybody. And then you're still going to pay us tribute. So it's up to you. But they didn't rule. They didn't care what your religion was. They didn't care what your culture was. In fact, they were quite interested in your culture. They were interested in your tradesmen and craftsmen and your skills, which sometimes they'd take back with them. And so anyway, what they would do is they would name these people, these princes, to be the tax collectors. Okay, and so it'd say Alexander Nevsky in 1252, you're going to be the tax collector. You're the Grand Duke or the Grand Prince of this area, this Vladimir Suzdal, Moscow. He leaves Moscow to his son Daniel and Vladimir to his son Dmitry. By 1320, Moscow had eclipsed Vladimir, and by 1480, Grand Prince Ivan III defeated the Mongols and became what first fell to be called Tsar of Russia. Okay, the Mongols and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I've talked about the Mongols in Russia. Well, they also, of course, take Kiev. And the Mongols, as I said, have a conglomerate. They control eventually all the way from including China, okay, all the way across Central Asia, into Russia, down into Eastern, Central Europe. They control the Middle East. I mean, it's a vast, vast territory. It was the largest empire, really. And as Genghis Khan dies, he leaves or puts his sons in charge, then his grandsons in charge. And again, just basically collecting tribute. They're also great traders. You've heard of the Silk Road. Okay, so the Mongols basically made the Silk Road safe. And John, you'll appreciate this. They issued letters of credit. So you didn't have to, our banker over here, so you didn't have to carry gold with you. And they gave safe passage. There was actually like a stick that you carried from the Mongols that gave you safe passage, and you better not fool with anybody or you're in trouble with the Mongols. Galicia Volhynia, I said that wrong, is considered the last of the independent Ukrainian principalities until the rise of the Cossacks. The Mongol invasion forced the Kievan Rus elites to choose for the first time between the Eastern Orthodox Church or the European West Roman Catholic Church led by the Pope. In 1325, significantly, the Eastern Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev moves first to Vladimir and then to Moscow, and Moscow becomes the third Rome. Okay, so you have Rome, you've got Constantinople, and now you have Moscow as the third Rome. And you might say, well, why is this important? Actually, I read an article. Putin actually has the gall to claim that he's acting to protect the Eastern Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, and of course, he's not at all religious. After the Mongols were defeated, Western Ukraine is controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and becomes Roman Catholic, while Eastern Ukraine and Belarus remain in the Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Church. And they're the two administrative areas of the East Slavic lands. The Crimea, which is sort of that island peninsula at the bottom in the south of Ukraine, is controlled by the Ottoman Turks, or the Crimean Khanate. So in 1596, Union of Brest places the Metropolitan of Kiev under the jurisdiction of Rome, dividing the Uniates church, which is basically a Catholic church with an Eastern flair to it, okay? And it's going to later be known as the Ukrainian, not Unitarian, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and it's different from the Orthodox Church. Galatia, we're going to talk a lot about that, so I just wanted to see roughly where it is on the map, okay? The Cossack Hetmanate comes in. So the Cossacks started off actually as their horses, they're mounted cavalry, and they start off coming into the Ukrainian area basically on hunting parties. But they quickly form sort of a military part of it, okay? Now, Ukraine in the 15th and 16th century are predominantly the cities or urban areas are occupied by Poles and Jews, okay? The ethnic Ukrainians are farmers. They tend to be out in the more rural areas, and many of them had fallen into serfdom. Well, how do you become a serf? You can't pay your taxes to the Grand Prince. Okay, so you become a serf. Now, a serf is not strictly a slave. You're not a chattel slave, meaning you cannot be bought or sold, but you also cannot leave the land. You're tied to the land, and the land can be sold. So you might end up changing masters, but you haven't actually moved, okay? So it's got definite advantages over chattel slavery where families are broken up, etc. The Cossacks being free men or semi-nomadic military groups. The Great Revolt of 1648, the Cossacks launched an uprising against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that led to the expulsion of many Polish landowners and massacres of many Jews. We're going to see there's going to be a lot of pogroms, which I'll explain more better in a few minutes. But the Jews in Ukraine have a hard time throughout the history. Where were we? The Cossacks established a state called the Hetmanate in central and eastern Ukraine. There's actually different groups of Cossacks. There are also official Cossacks and unofficial Cossacks, okay? Now, official Cossacks mean that you have been recognized by the Tsar of Russia as sort of an official military group, and your officers are actually given ranks in the Russian army, okay? In 1654, the Cossacks are recognized by the Tsar, which is what I basically just explained. 1667, a truce divides Ukraine along the Dnieper River between Moscow and Poland, leading to another Cossack uprising. There's going to be lots of Cossack uprisings. Okay, so this is the Hetmanate of the Cossacks, and as I said, there are different groups, but basically it's surrounded by Russia to the east, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the north, the Austrian Habsburg Empire to the west, and the Ottoman Empire to the south. So they're not under any pressure or anything. The Great Northern War and the end of the Hetmanate. So Sweden, that great empire, okay, which it doesn't, to the modern ear, it just doesn't sound right. But they were building an empire. They were on the offense, trying to build one in northern Central Europe. Tsar Peter I, who's Peter the Great, yes, the 6'9" Peter the Great, okay, who was a brilliant, brilliant man, was fighting to prevent the Swedish expansion. Peter had also been limiting some of the Cossacks' rights, so the Cossacks aren't happy with Peter, so they go and fight for the Swedes. In 1709, Russia defeats Sweden and the Cossacks at the Battle of Poltava, leading to the end of the office of the Hetman and the Cossacks' autonomy. So they were operating as an autonomous state. In other words, they were under the purview of the Tsar, but they had their own, they could control their own local governments. In 1721, the Peace of Nystadt ended the Great Northern War. In the treaty, Sweden cedes to Russia, Estonia, Latvia, which was called Livonia at the time, part of Finland, and including present-day St. Petersburg in the Baltic region. As a result, the Swedish Empire ends, and Russia becomes a major European empire. So this is how Russia becomes considered an empire. 1764, 1780, Empress Catherine II, Catherine the Great, is a German princess, but she's brought in to marry the heir to the Russian throne, who's challenged in many ways. She marries him. She has him killed. Which probably wasn't a bad thing for Russia, because she was really smart and he wasn't. Basically takes over and becomes Empress Catherine, okay? So she liquidates the Hetmanate as part of her centralizing reforms of Russia in 1783, and Russia also annexed the Crimea. She starts off as an enlightened monarch or despot, but then as she goes on in her reign, she becomes more conservative. Enlightened, we mean that she was operating for the good of the people. In 1791, Catherine II creates the Pale of Settlement, okay, which prohibits Poles and Jews from moving into the Russian heartland, and Ukraine becomes part of the Pale. So basically what they've done, or what they did, was they created ghettos, if you will, or towns or areas that were where the Jews had to live, okay, and that's obviously very problematic. Partition of Ukraine and the Dnieper River. I just put this slide up so you could see the Dnieper River. You see where Kiev, so it's a long river that runs sort of down the center, and that's going to play a major part geographically and politically, so I just wanted you to see where it is. Partitions. The Ottoman Empire had taken over the lands once controlled by the Mongols in the Crimea and the Black Sea area. So as the Mongols lose their power, as it goes down through these generations of sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, of course, never works out so well. So the Ottoman Empire, who are Islamic or Muslim, come in and take over. Poland was under great pressure and control from the Russian Empire, leading to the Polish-Russian War, and Russia wins. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were much weakened by internal strife, and they were defeated by Russia in the Russo-Turkish War of 1768-1774, resulting in Russia seizing the Crimea, which I'd mentioned. Catherine the Great refers to it as Little Russia or New Russia. Okay, so she's calling that area Little Russia or New Russia. The Ukrainians don't like that, okay, but they can't do much about it. Now, Poland was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire between 1772 and 1795, with Galicia going to the Habsburgs and the rest of Ukraine going to Russia. I know there's a lot of this, but the reason I'm showing you this, I want you to understand the complexity and how politically things are going back and forth, okay? And why Russia might feel that they have ownership or some right to certain parts of Ukraine, and how the Ukrainians are saying, wait a minute. So I'm trying to go through this step by step so you'll understand that and can see it. And it is confusing. So don't try to remember anything other than that it's confusing. There won't be a test. Okay. Napoleon's invasion leads to nationalism. I did a whole talk a few years ago in here on how Napoleon led to nationalism throughout Europe and really throughout the war. So Napoleon defeated Prussia in 1807. He creates the Duchy of Warsaw out of the territories Prussia had received in the partition of Poland, okay? Of course, in June 24, 1812, Napoleon invades Russia. Okay, big mistake. He, of course, goes through Poland, Ukraine, and just 6 months later, he comes rolling back through with 500,000 fewer men, which is really sad because they all died of, cold and malnutrition. So he goes back, and it's going to lead to his downfall. The parts of Poland under Russian rule saw the French invasion as a chance to break free of Russia, and they fought with Napoleon. The Ukrainian Cossacks fought with the Tsar's army against Napoleon. So again, you've got this split. We're going to see this in several wars where half the country sides with the invaders, the other half of the country sides with Russia. In countries across Europe that had been conquered by Napoleon, as I just said a minute ago, nationalism grew up. It's the first time, really, that people think of themselves as part of a country as opposed to a part of a kingdom, if you will. So this is really going to grow, and in Ukraine it's no different. Ukraine was no exception, with language, literature, folklore, and history all contributing to this modern Ukrainian national identity. We're going to see language is really important, okay? The Ukrainian language to them. Okay. Crackdown on nationalism and russification. So the Congress of Vienna was held, obviously in Vienna, And actually, Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, had called, so we need to have this Congress. We need to get all the kings of Europe who had been displaced, the royal family's been displaced by Napoleon, and let's talk about how we're going to put Europe back together and put us back in power, right? So they meet, and they reestablish an autonomous Poland. So they recreate Poland, but they gave Alexander I control over a vast area of Poland and, of course, Ukraine. In 1831, his son, Nicholas I, wants to thwart the nationalist movements in Poland and Ukraine. He issued a russification program based on 3 pillars of autocracy, in other words, a king with unlimited power, the orthodoxy, which is the Russian Orthodox Church, and Russian nationalism. Okay, so not Ukrainian nationalism, not Polish nationalism, but Russian nationalism. Okay. So, urban self-government and local law codes were abolished. The Russian language, and here we get into language, was to be used in education and any interactions with government. In 1832, orthodoxification was instituted to convert any 8 Catholic churches to Russian Orthodoxy. And in 1839, it's made official, the Act of Union, where 1,600 Eastern Unionate churches, along with 1.5 million parishioners, are just said, okay, you're now Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Christians. Nicholas's imperial government cracked down on Ukrainian nationalists, including political leaders and poets, arresting them and sentencing many to exile in Russia. Alexander II, as you remember, emancipates the serfs in 1861, and in 1863, a ban on all Ukrainian language publications is issued. So you can't speak the language officially, and now you can't print or write in the language. Industrialization and urbanization. So in the 1850s, oil is discovered in Galicia and becomes one of the world's largest oil-producing regions. 1870, a Welsh entrepreneur established a very large metallurgical, did I say that right? My mouth is really dry. On the Donets River, turning the Donbass region into a major industrial area. Okay, this is important, of course, because what is Putin really trying to get is the Donbass, because that's where a lot of industry, a lot of the wealth of the country is. And a lot of Russians are there too, Russian speakers, so we'll talk about how that happens. Many Russian peasants moved into the Donbass area providing labor, and these processes change Ukraine's economic, social, and political landscape for generations to come. Now, Crimea, in 1854, Russia lost to Britain and France in the Crimean War. The Paris Peace Treaty that officially ended the war prohibited Russia from having naval bases on the Black Sea. Okay, and of course, they need the Black Sea because it's a warm port, and the rest of their ports are frozen for a good part of the year. Now, the Russian Empire is terribly embarrassed by this loss, and so it was a quick loss too in the war. So they decide we need to modernize, and what does a modern country need? Railroads, especially railroads the size, in a country the size of Russia. So, but they need cash to build the railroads. So, we got this Alaska. We're not going to do anything with it. Speak to with the Secretary of State and see what we can work out. So they sell it to the United States. How does that work out well for the United States? Gold, okay, and then eventually, of course, oil too. The United States is lucky. We do this a lot. Let's get California. A couple of years later, oh, gold. Son of a gun. But anyway, So they do that to raise the capital and to build railroads. Peasant overpopulation in villages after the emancipation of the serfs led to famine. And the newly built railroads led to urbanization as peasants moved from both Russia and Ukraine into Ukrainian industrial centers and into cities. This is going to create the proletariat class. And those of you who listen to my Russian Soviet lectures, you know who the proletariats are. They're the working class that are, of course, Lenin's going to pull into his revolution. 1905 revolution, Bloody Sunday. Workers, their wives, their children are in Palace Square in St. Petersburg. And there's a Ukrainian priest, actually, who's carrying a petition to the Tsar to basically ask just for some food, because they're starving, and some, modifications of the rules that they're working under. Well, the Tsar's army, the Tsar's not there, but his army goes out and shoots and kills hundreds and hundreds of these really peaceful protesters. Starts a revolution. The workers took to the street, and this is Nicholas II by this point. Nicholas and Alexander, he's the last Tsar of the Romanov dynasty. Conservative supporters of the Tsar blamed the Jews for the problems of industrialization and crop failure. So new pogroms, which is government-supported anti-Semitism, but it's really a lot more than that. It's violent, right? Were instituted, leading to many deaths, destroying homes and businesses. And Ukrainian and Russian workers join in this violence against the Jews in the pogrom. In 1905, in October, Nicholas is forced to issue the October Manifesto, granting male suffrage and civil rights and protections to the citizens. Restrictions on the Ukrainian language publications was lifted immediately, and immediately there's a rise in nationalism because Ukrainians, like Russians, are big poets. So there's lots of poetry, revolutionary poets, or nationalist poetry that comes out. The manifesto divided Ukraine politically between monarchists and nationalists. So politically within the country, there's a division. The Duma, which is the legislature, was established in St. Petersburg, and 95 Ukrainians are elected. 45 of these members soon created the Ukrainian Club. Okay, so to promote Ukrainian culture and pro-Ukrainian political agenda. The Tsar is unhappy, not just for this reason, for many reasons with the Duma. He disbands the Duma. The Duma comes back, he disbands it again. The Duma comes back, he disbands it again. It happens several times. It's not going to work out well for the Tsar and his family eventually. And of course, people are unhappy that the Duma is disbanded all the time. So what he's doing is he's getting rid of sort of the legal way they could have reformed. Okay? So what's left? Violence. World War I, though, breaks out. 1914. The Ukrainians, say we're loyal to the Tsar, we're loyal to Russia, but that sort of doesn't matter. The government cracks down on many minority nationalist groups. Ukrainian language publications are shut down again. The last remnants of liberalism from the 1905 revolution disappear. Okay, and by liberalism, we're meaning not policy liberalism so much, but more, the right to elect a Duma, etc. All this dashed the hopes of Ukrainian leaders who saw the war as an opportunity to create an autonomous Ukraine within the Russian state. Ukrainian liberals declare neutrality, refusing to fight for either side, while leftist radicals turned to Austria in hopes of defeating the Russian Empire. And Austria-Hungary controlled Galicia and the city of Lviv, which you've heard a lot about in western Ukraine. The Austria-Hungary government arrested and incarcerated 20,000 Ukrainian Russophiles, other words, supporters of the Tsar, and 3,000 of these will die of cold and malnutrition. The Russian army comes in and briefly recaptures the area and puts Russification back in. In 1915, the German-Austrian offensive captured Galicia and western Ukraine, and the Russophiles retreated eastward with the Russian army, and many settling along the Russo-Ukrainian ethnic border. Okay, so during World War I, as you remember, the Russian Revolution of 1917 breaks out. And there's war losses, you've got Rasputin, you've got the apple, you've got all this craziness going on. And certainly a big problem was the Soviet army, the Russian army, it's not Soviet yet, the Imperial Army is terribly prepared. Protests in the streets. Eventually, Nicholas II abdicates his throne.
Are they the one that killed in Siberia? You know, the movie or something that I saw, the whole family was... Yes,
yeah, it's going to be his family in another year is going to be executed by the Bolsheviks. So it's his family. A provisional government led by the moderate Mensheviks, which are moderate socialists, took control of the Russian Empire, set up a provisional government. The problem the mistake they make is they don't withdraw from the war. So a lot of the problems Russia is facing, though there is great famine, there's also, they're still fighting the war, and the Russian people aren't behind it. The Russian soldiers are not behind it, really. So they're going to get overthrown by the Bolsheviks, led by, of course, Vladimir Lenin in October 1917. The moderate nationalists, called the Society of Ukrainian Progressives, want to trade their loyalty to the new regime for cultural reforms, including the right to teach Ukrainian language in school. So they go to Lenin and say, listen, we'll work with you, just let us have our own culture and our own language, and we'll be good citizens. Now, young radical nationalists in the Central Rada, which is Ukraine's revolutionary parliament, wanted to declare an independent Ukrainian state. So, 1918 to 1920, Ukrainian governments in the Russian and Austrian-controlled parts of Ukraine declare independence, but they're going to be overwhelmed by the more powerful Bolshevik government in Russia and the Polish Republic. You know, I always said I never taught just wars and dates, but I feel like I'm teaching wars and dates. So I apologize. But again, I'm just trying to have you understand the complexity here. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was when the Bolsheviks, Lenin's government, went to Germany and Austria-Hungary and said, listen, we're out of here, let's have a treaty. So Germany and Austria-Hungary, of course, said, great, because then they could just go fight mainly on the Western Front. And so as part of that treaty, Russia agrees to give up all claims to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, and Ukraine, okay? Of course, that's going to be short-lived because of Germany and Austria-Hungary lose in 1918, and there's an armistice signed, and of course the Treaty of Versailles takes that away, their independence. So the Russian Civil War is going to break out in 1917 to 1922. The Reds, of course, are the Bolsheviks, the Communists, versus the Whites, who were supporters of the Tsars. Plus, there's a lot of Western powers, including the United States, put troops in to help the Whites. But eventually, of course, the Reds defeat the Whites, and it's a communist victory. Within this Russian Civil War is the Polish-Ukrainian War, okay? There are two short-lived independent Ukrainian states, West Ukrainian People's Republic and Ukrainian People's Republic. They fight against against Poland. but they're very short-lived. The war weakened Ukraine's independence when the Soviets entered the war, leading to the Polish-Soviet War. A lot of wars. The Russian-Soviet army made it to the outskirts of Warsaw before the Western powers stopped them. While the fighting occurs, all of Ukrainian Jews suffer yet another pogrom. Jews were attacked by all sides, including the Reds, Whites, Ukrainian army, and warlords, and about 30,000 people perished by 1919. Lenin, needing the support of Ukrainian elites, eases cultural restrictions in Ukraine. So he says, Lenin was kind of a pragmatist. I know it sounds funny to hear me say that, or a lot you've learned about Lenin to say, well, he's so ideological. But he grows to be a pragmatist, but then he dies before, and of course then Stalin's going to come in. So he said, listen, we don't want to be fighting the Ukrainians. Let's let them have their language and culture, okay? But of course, it's not going to last. So after World War I, despite the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Ukraine, because of internal divisions within Ukraine, aren't able to really pull off becoming a sovereign, separate, free country. So this is just the map of there's a flag on the left, which is the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. That's going to be one of 15 Soviet republics. And you can see the green is what they were in 1922, and then in 1939, the yellow was added from Polish territory and so forth down to the different colors. So Ukraine really grows in size during this time period. Communism. 1920 is introduced in the Soviet Ukraine, and it becomes part of the Soviet Union, which I just said, called the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The name is changed in 1939 to Ukraine Socialist Soviet Republic. They swapped the two words. The Soviet Union actually went through several constitutions. That's probably why that happened. In 1921 to 23, the remaining Ukrainian territories were divided between Poland and Romania and Czechoslovakia. The population of Ukraine was just under 30 million, with 80% Ukrainian, 10% Russian, and 5.5% Jews. Now, there are a lot of other subgroups. 55,000 people were members of the Communist Party in Ukraine. Now you see that Ukrainians are 80% of the population, but the Russians hold 53% of the party belonging to the party. You have to be invited to the party. It's like the Puritans. You get invited to the church, you got to get invited to the party. I'm probably in big trouble now for just saying the Puritans were like communists. I didn't mean that, okay. The 24% Ukrainian and Jews and other minorities made up the rest of that 55,000. Rural Ukrainians saw the communist government as an occupying force. They didn't like them. Now, Lenin dies in 1924 of a stroke, and Stalin takes control. Stalin very briefly supported Lenin's policies, but it's not going to last. In 1929, he starts the first of the show trials, and he starts it in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, and it's aimed at Ukrainian intelligentsia. Several hundred people are arrested, several hundred people go to jail, and 15 are actually executed. Now, a show trial is a kangaroo court, basically, but it's televised or put on film. And they bring people in. They would usually torture them into confessing, okay? And they'd say, okay, if you confess, we won't kill your whole family. So they'd get up in the trial and say, yeah, I did all this bad stuff. And of course, they were convicted. And there's going to be many show trials during the 1930s. Ukraine under Stalin. During this time, 300,000 ethnic Poles were moved to Ukrainian lands on the Polish side of the state. So they're moved west, okay, and Ukrainians are going to be moved east. Stalin moves a lot of people around, okay, and he did it obviously for political reasons. Many people, Ukrainians, moved from Poland to the United States, and then after, in the 1920s, of course, if you remember, the United States basically shut down immigration. So they went to Canada or Argentina. Stalin consolidated his power by 1928 and moved to industrialize the Soviet Union. Ukraine is actually 2% of the territory of the Soviet Union, but they had 20% of the population, so they're going to play an important part. This is very important. They're the breadbasket of really Eastern Europe and Russia, okay? And you wonder what's going on now with the bread, and they have been all along. They have very deep, rich soil, excellent soil. Okay, so in 1928, Stalin initiated the first of his 5-year plans. At first, Ukraine received a fair amount of capital investment, but beginning in 1932, most of the investment went to Siberia and the Urals, away from what Stalin considered the dangerous Polish borders. With the right bank of the Dnieper, which remained mainly agricultural, most investment went into defenses for the Red Army, the Communist Army. And the biggest project was actually, it's interesting, Stalin brought in all these American engineers for his railroads, for dams, for all sorts of things. And this fellow, and I didn't put his name down, but he had headed up building the Wilson Dam in the United States. The Soviets actually deposited $50,000 in his bank account before he agreed to work for them. And he said, well, I got the money, I guess I'll do it. So he built this huge power dam. Collectivization, this is awful. Stalin forced many Ukrainian rural villages to work on large construction projects. So one thing he did, like the dams, he'd pull farmers out to work on them. Remember, this is his breadbasket. In 1929, collectivization was introduced to the agriculture. So he took peasant farmers, took them off their land, which they had been farming for, generations, and put them to live in communes. Took them out of their houses, and they'd eat in a communal kitchen, and they were to work communally, okay? Farmers don't work that way. They have a love of the land. They have a love of their crops, and so they resist it. To make things worse, Stalin and his government was taking the food that the collectives were actually growing and selling it because they needed hard currency. The ruble wasn't considered hard currency. Nobody wanted it in the world market, so they needed dollars, okay? And so they were selling it. They were shipping it to areas around, industrial areas around the Soviet Union. Now, wealthy peasants, and I know that sounds like a funny phrase, but a peasant is just a farmer, okay? But wealthy peasants who were kulaks, and that's actually the Russian version of kulak, the spelling of it, had been the most productive food producers. But of course, they resisted collectivization. They said, don't do it, we'll sell you food. No, they came in, many were shot on the spot. 75,000 families were sent to Siberia, okay? He's killing the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The Holodomor and the Great Purge, these are two different things. So 32 to 33, there's a great famine. It's a man-made famine. I saw all different numbers of deaths from this. So I just said a range of 3 to 7 million victims, which is huge. It's referred to often as a terror famine because it was done to terrorize the people into into the communes. Since 2006, Ukraine and 15 other nations have recognized the Holodomor as a genocide carried out by the Soviet Union against the Ukrainian people. Think about that. Targets of the purges. Okay, the Great Purges. Stalin's a paranoid guy. In order to strengthen his own position as head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, he carries out these purges. We talked about the show trials, but he just had literally millions of people are going to be murdered. Targets of the purge include the old Bolsheviks, the people who he worked with in the revolution. He didn't want any challenges or anybody to remember anything that was potentially negative about him. So they went first. Then nationalists, eventually generals are going to be killed right before World War II. Doctors are going to be killed, actually, for the most part, after World War II. In Ukraine, 270,000 Ukrainians were arrested and nearly half were executed during this time period. I mean, just, yes?
Can I just make a comment? Holodomor means death by hunger. Actually, they literally translate death by hunger.
Thank you very much. I did not know that. Thank you. And I'm glad you're here, sir. I don't remember your name. I remember you, but he's from Ukraine. So it's wonderful to have you here. I hope you don't mind me pointing you out, but it's great. When you walked out, I was very happy. Okay. Yeah, next slide. There we go. World War II and Hitler's Lebensraum. Okay, we all know the story of Hitler. We know Lebensraum. We know that he had his Aryan race. We know that he wrote Mein Kampf, and when he was arrested in his first attempt to take over Germany in 1923-24. He comes to power in 1933. He puts in all sorts of programs against the Jews in Germany, and he was going to expand it, okay? Lebensraum means living space. So and Ukraine was like the centerpiece. Okay, it was a very profitable country with that rich soil and minerals and oil and all this stuff. And so he said, we'll take Ukraine, we'll get rid of the Jews, we'll get rid of a lot of the Slavs, because he didn't think much of them either. And we'll take that over and have our Aryan youth move there. So in August 1939, of course, Hitler has taken over the Sudeten land. He's taken over all of Czechoslovakia, and next he's going to move on Poland. Now, when he knows that the West is going to, England and France are going to come in and fight him when he goes into Poland, so he doesn't want a two-front war right away. So he makes a deal in August 1939, so just weeks before the start of the war and before he goes into Poland. It's called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression pact between the two. And also in the pact, they agreed to divvy up Poland and actually Finland as well. By October 1939, the Polish army had been defeated, and the Soviets released most of the captured Polish rank-and-file soldiers, but detained an estimated 15,000 Polish officers who were really from the elite class, the educated elite class, and massacre them in the Katyn Forest near Smolensk in the spring of 1940. Now, the Soviets blamed the Germans, and most of the world thought it was the Germans for a long, long time until the fall of the Soviet Union, and then the truth came out. The Soviets also turned back at the border Polish Jews who were fleeing the Nazis. Ukraine during World War II. So Hitler attacks the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941 in Operation Barbarossa. It stretches all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It's 3.8 million soldiers from Germany, Hungary, and Romania. The Red Army, which is about the same number of people, and it's got a huge army, but they're not well equipped. A lot of the generals have been purged, so they're not particularly well led, are going to be quickly forced backwards, and they use a scorched earth policy, which means they burn everything as they either burn it, or they destroy it, or they steal it and take it with them. So by December 1940, the Red Army has lost almost it should be 41, right? The Red Army has lost all of Ukraine, along with 3.5 million officers and soldiers who fell into German captivity. So 3.5 million were actually captured because Stalin, when they get surrounded, wouldn't let them surrender. A lot were killed, but a lot of them had to surrender. I mean, he wouldn't let them fall back before they were encircled, is what I'm trying to say. Many in Ukraine welcomed the German advance in the summer of 1940, hoping for an end of the Soviet Union terror. Now they said, well, maybe we'll have true socialism, because the Nazis were the National Socialists, even though they weren't socialists at all, but that's what the party was called. They also said, Germany's a Western European country. What we've seen is they have a pretty good standard of living. We can hardly afford food. How bad can it be? Okay, so at first they kind of welcome the Germans, but that's going to end really quickly. The hopes of the Ukrainians quickly vanished when Heinrich Himmler, the SS, and Goering, who was the just behind Hitler, and he's also the head of the Air Force, began to implement their racial policy and squeeze the newly conquered territories of every economic resource they had. Ukrainian nationals began fighting with the Germans, but then end up fighting with the communists, the Soviets. The Holocaust. Okay, so German treatment of Soviet prisoners was terrible. Okay, Stalin had refused to sign the Geneva Convention of 1929 that set rules for treatment of political prisoners of war. The Germans did not recognize rank. They failed to provide medical treatment or parcels of food and clothing. Orders were given to shoot on capture Red Army commissars, political officers, NKVD, which are secret service, or not secret service, but secret police, and of course Jews. Most Ukrainian Jews never made it to concentration camps out of Ukraine. They were simply murdered. Himmler's Einsatzgruppen, which I probably just destroyed that pronunciation, but the SS death squads, entered cities and villages, rounded up Jews of all ages, and marched them to ravines or man-made ditches and shot them. FiveYear, just outside of Kiev, 33,761 Jewish citizens, men, old men, women, children, whole families, were shot in 2 days. They'd march them out to a ravine, line them up, usually make them strip because they wanted their clothing and belongings and stuff, and shot them into the ditch. And it's just unbelievable. It really, when you see the images today in Ukraine, this comes back. Oops, this comes back. In 1942, Germans started to recruit young non-Jewish Ukrainians with false advertising to move to Germany for good-paying jobs, right? 2.2 million people said, oh, we'll go. Well, we'll go and for a better life. They got there, they were put into slave labor camps and made to produce, German armaments and what else, everything else. Many die of malnutrition, disease, and Allied bombing. During the Nazi occupation, in these 3 years, it is estimated between 1.2 and 1.6 million citizens died in the Ukrainian Holocaust. About 1.1 million, I read, were Jews. The victors. So, in September 6th, 1943, 49-year-old Nikita Khrushchev okay, who's a political commissar of the first Ukrainian front of the Red Army, enters Kiev, and the place is intact. The Germans didn't destroy it when they left, but it appears to be empty. And this man runs out of a building and runs up to Khrushchev and throws his arms around him and says, thank you, I'm the only Jew still alive in Kyiv. And Khrushchev says, how did you live? And he goes, well, my wife is Ukrainian, and she hid me. And but then people start to come out. So at first, they greet the Soviets, the returning Soviets, as heroes, that they're coming to rescue them from the Germans. But Khrushchev has orders from Stalin. Now, Khrushchev actually grows up right on the Russian eastern Ukrainian border, and he's a peasant. He grows up as a peasant. He actually has a lot of good feelings for Ukrainians. But his job is he's got to reincorporate them into the Soviet Socialist Republic. So not all Ukrainians were happy. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists formed a 100,000-man Red Army to fight against the Red Army, The Soviets quickly, though, move to place the Communist Party leadership in cities after Nazis forced to prevent local Ukrainian leadership from returning to power. So the Soviets come in, they go into the cities and larger towns, and they very quickly put communists in positions of power or leadership, so Ukrainians cannot, or non-communists can't come and start to run the cities and towns. 7 million Ukrainians fought for the Red Army in World War II. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, so this is the conference that FDR attends when he was extremely ill from hardening of the arteries. The big three, of course, is Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin, agreed that the Soviets should control the regions east of the original Molotov-Ribbentrop line. This led the way for the Soviet Eastern Bloc in Eastern and Central Europe, okay? Now, you say, well, why would they do that? Well, remember, the Soviets played a huge part in defeating the Germans, losing 20 million people, something like that. So that was part of it. Plus they had this huge army. How are you going to stop them? Okay. So this is an expansion of the Soviet republics and the addition of Soviet satellite countries after World War II. So you can see USSR in 1938 is dark red. And that's just the western section of it. You see, and this is Ukrainian, the Eastern Bloc, part of Ukraine, plus the satellite countries. So the more, the lighter red, I guess you would say, annexed or expanded the Soviet Socialist republics, including Ukraine and Belarus. The satellite countries, which we know, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, which of course have been created by the Treaty of Versailles, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, part of Poland, and East Germany, and a small section of Austria, all come under the Soviet sphere. Okay. Stalin moves to regain control. We're almost to our break in our cookies. Charles, Jana baked cookies. Dr. Davis, he's back here. I'm so excited to see him. I haven't seen him in 2 years. My biggest fan, and I'm his. So Stalin insisted that Belarus and Ukraine, with their new western boundaries, be admitted to the newly created United Nations. So think about this. You know, we're thinking about that essential question, right? Does Russia have any rights to Ukraine? So here's Stalin saying basically, oh, they're independent countries. They should be join the United Nations as an independent country. Now, he did this to help legitimize the new Soviet borders. Stalin next moved against the Polish-Ukrainian nationalist underground movements by forcing Poles to move west and ethnic Ukrainians to move east. Many ethnic Russians were sent into eastern Ukraine to replace the departed Poles. Remember, when we get to the war, that area that, in eastern Ukraine and Crimea are going to be saying, wait a minute, we're all Russians, we should be part of Russia. Well, this is how the Russians get there. More than 500,000 Ukrainians were deported. Stalin wanted to move all Ukrainians east, but Khrushchev said, no, wait a minute, that's way too many, can't do it. But 180,000 Ukrainians from western Ukraine were arrested and sent to Siberia. Okay, a lot of the Russian officers and troops that actually made it to Germany, when they came back to Russia, were arrested because they had seen the West, okay? Couldn't be trusted, and a lot of them get shipped to Siberia. Stalin also closed the borders by posting border guards between Ukraine and the West. And this ended the Ukrainian elite's hopes of a more closely connected with Western Europe. In the newly expanded Western Ukraine, Stalin had to deal with radical nationalism represented by a well-organized political structure and Ukrainian insurgent army, which we're going to get to. Okay, I think this is the go. Break time. Now, just before, Jenny, you want to take the top off? These are little Ukrainian snowball cookies.
We just call Ukraine.
Ukrainian cookies. And now it's a big crowd. She baked for a couple of days. These take a while to make. So if you could each just take one to begin with, that would be greatly appreciated. They're in little paper cups, and there's napkins, and there's a trash barrel. Let's do a quick break, because I've still got several slides to go through, and I want to have time for discussion. Well, welcome back. Were the cookies good?
Yeah.
The road to independence. This is the long road, the long and winding road. Okay, the Second Soviet Republic. Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations, but it's going to be about 50 years before they're really an independent nation. Newly acquired territory that they received after World War II, it appears that they did really well, right? Because they get all this new territory. But in fact, they'd lost 7 million people who died, 10 million were homeless, 700,000 cities and 2,800 villages and towns lay in ruins. And here they're going through that again. And the industry was producing 25% of its pre-war output. Agricultural production was down 60%, and it had lost 80% of its industrial machinery. So Moscow made the decision to only rebuild Ukraine's heavy industry. Stalin was always about heavy industry, while everything else would have to wait. In 1946, Ukraine suffered another terrible drought, and it's going to lead to yet another famine. Stalin, in the middle of this, demanded that millions of tons of grain that they were able to grow had to be shipped to the newly acquired Soviet satellite countries to keep them sort of happy, so they wouldn't revolt. These conditions allowed Ukrainian nationalism to grow and to challenge Soviet rule, and then Stalin dies of a stroke in 1953, and he's replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, Khrushchev and Brezhnev. I've already talked to you about Khrushchev's background being a peasant farmer, a peasant farm family. He's a smart guy. He's kind of a rough and tumble peasant, but he is educated, and he comes up through the ranks fairly quickly in the Communist Party. He often was actually in charge of Ukraine, of the Communist Party representative in Ukraine. So he had sort of fond feelings for Ukraine, but they're usually anything he tries to do is thwarted by Stalin. In '54, when he comes to power, Russia and Ukraine, he celebrates. He goes to Ukraine. They put up a big monument, I think in Kyiv, and celebrates the eternal friendship between the Russians and Ukrainians. And as a gesture, Ukraine was given back control of Crimea, even though 71% of its population were actually ethnic Russians. Now, it also kind of made sense because Crimea is not contiguous with Russia, okay? So they had to go by water or go through Ukraine to get there. So in '56, he makes a famous speech, secret speech, to the Communist Party, or, big yearly get-together, where he basically denounces Stalin. And the thing that really stuck out to me is one of the things he said was, all of you who have been educated, in the last 20, 25 years, the Russian history you were taught is all a lie. Okay? It was Stalin propaganda. And he comes out and says this. So anyway, he then puts in what's called the Khrushchev Thaw, which allows for new freedoms. It allows for many dissident writers, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's the physicist who writes the wonderful books. And if you haven't read them, he's passed away now a long time ago. He actually ended up living in Vermont. Read some of them. Gulag Archipelago. Cancer Ward is the other really good one. Thank you. Cancer Ward. Anyways, they were released from political prisons. Despite Khrushchev's reforms, the Soviet economy is not doing well. A bloodless coup, he's basically overthrown by his number 2 man, who was actually had replaced him in Ukraine, Leonid Brezhnev, forcing Khrushchev into retirement. Big difference is he's not killed. Brezhnev quickly, though, undid many of Khrushchev's reforms and re-implemented harsh Soviet policies. A lot of the Russians were not happy with post-Stalinism because there seemed to be chaos. Their economy actually went down. That's really what gets Gorbachev in the end. Mikhail Gorbachev, speak of the son of a gun. Brezhnev dies in 1982. There's 2 short-term premiers that take over, Andropov and Kosygin, I think, and very short-term because they die. They're old men and they die. So Gorbachev, who's a young guy comparatively, is selected by the Politburo to lead Russia in 1985. He doesn't have Ukrainian connections where Khrushchev and Brezhnev definitely had spent a lot of time in Ukraine and brought in Ukrainian communists into the power structure. Gorbachev doesn't. He brings in his own people. Now, so it sort of soured the relationship, and then 1986, Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster, which we all remember, and of course it's been in the news. 50,000 square kilometers were contaminated, 90,000 inhabitants forced to evacuate. The Soviet officials lied, said, oh, it's not a big deal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for a while until they realized it was a really big deal. And so this leads Ukrainians and other people to start to question their relationship with Moscow, okay? So Gorbachev, who I said grew up in the post-Stalin era, wants to modernize and reform the Soviet Union. So he introduces 2 policies. Perestroika, which means restructuring of the Soviet bureaucracy to make it more efficient, and glasnost, or openness, allowing for public criticism of Soviet leadership. Now, they were really more than that. I'm simplifying it, but you get the idea. So Ukrainians adopted the ideas of what was known as the Helsinki, from Finland, movement, and called for rights, including human rights and rights of countries or nations to be free. 89 to 90. So 1989 was a turning point in Ukrainian political history. Mass politics and semi-free elections come to the Soviet parliament in Ukraine. There's pro-democratic deputies called the People's Council, changed the politics in Kyiv. First political mass organization, the Popular Movement for Perestroika. Within the first 2 years, 600,000 Ukrainians joined it. And the legalization of the Ukrainian, probably should say Greek Catholic Church, okay? In 1990, the Ukrainian parliament followed the footsteps of the Baltic states, and they declared that they're a sovereign nation. But of course, Moscow says, wait, not so fast. Gorbachev, who had been weakened by a poor economy and attacks from both the left and the right in Russia, was unable to stop Republic's assertion of sovereignty. So Gorbachev was loved by the West. He was not loved in the Soviet Union at all, especially by the hardline communists. So he's unable to stop them from declaring sovereignty. And it's not just Ukraine, it's the Baltic states. It's, there's, again, 15 republics. Russia's just one of them. When Communist Party leaders attempted to crack down on the dissidents and democratic nationalists, students went on a hunger strike in Maidan, which is Independence Square, and were soon supported by 50,000 Kievans who came out to protect the students. Ukrainians were divided, though. Some people said, no, we should be autonomous, but within the Soviet Union. And others said, no, we need to be a free, sovereign nation. In 1991, this will surprise you, unless you remember it, I didn't. 1991, President George H.W. Bush flew to Kyiv and urged Ukrainians to stay in the USSR, not to break away from the Soviet Union. He told Ukrainians to avoid confusing freedom and independence. Now, why would he do that? Okay. Well, Ukraine had a huge nuclear arsenal, for one thing. Huge. It was the third largest arsenal in the world. So that was one thing. He was also afraid of a dissolving Soviet Union would cause chaos. Okay? If you remember, actually, at the same time in the war in Iraq, right, he did not overthrow Saddam Hussein because he didn't want to cause chaos. Yes, sir?
Before he came to Kiev, he was in Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
So they tuned his ear to say, and what did the West call his speech? Chicken Kiev.
I saw that. Yeah. Oh, wow, yeah. If you didn't hear that, President Bush went to Moscow first, got the word from Moscow, and when he went to Ukraine, it was called Chicken Kiev, which you all remember as a dish, or Chicken Kiev, right? Chicken meaning afraid to go against them. Okay. Independence. So Boris Yeltsin, okay, who's going to be the head of Russia for a while. He had been I believe he was the former mayor of Moscow. He was the number 2 man, basically, to Gorbachev, and he leads basically a revolt. Okay, and they actually go to Gorbachev's summer dacha, where he's on vacation for the weekend, and they surround him, but he's able to get out and come back to Moscow, and there's all chaos and everything. Now, December 1st, 1991, Ukrainians went to vote on a referendum on whether to declare independence. Gorbachev allowed this because he said they will never get more than 70% of the people saying they want independence. And they said you need 70% to actually declare independence. The turnout was 84%, with more than 90% of those voting favoring independence, including 58% of the ethnic Russians. 60% of the Jews also voted in favor of independence. So there was a huge movement for independence. Ukrainians, it was like 99% or something voted for independence. So Ukraine's independence spelled the end of the USSR. Again, Ukraine is an extremely important country. It's part of the Soviet Union. It leaves, the Baltic states leaves, and the USSR basically comes to an end. December 25th, 1991, I watched it on television, and Gorbachev resigns. And he basically said, life is terrible, then you die. Essentially, that's what he said, and it's not a joke. It's basically what he said. He said it's come to the end. I was actually in Suzdal, remember Suzdal, Vladimir, 100 miles east of Moscow, in March of 1990, when Gorbachev declared the end of the Civil War. And I was in a bar in the basement of a former convent. Did you know all convents had bars? I didn't know that. But anyway, so I was in this bar, and we all celebrated, and it was a wonderful time. But here he is stepping down. So Yeltsin serves as the first president of the Russian Federation from 91 to 99. He's alcoholic. He's got heart problems. It wasn't good. Yeltsin pushed for a Commonwealth of States to replace the Soviet Union, sort of like a confederation of states, almost like before we became the United States of America with the Constitution. We had the Confederation, similar to that, which would be an economic and military alliance between the former Soviet republics. In 1993, Ukraine refuses to join the Commonwealth. They even refuse a defense pact, which made things very complicated because the Soviet Black Fleet, of course, was in Crimea and Odessa, and then Ukraine nuclear arsenal, as I had said, was a huge nuclear arsenal. Okay. Challenges for independence. Of course, there's ethnic religious diversity in Ukraine. After they left the Soviet sphere, there's catastrophic economic decline, 48% of industrial production, 60% of the GDP, which is actually worse than what happened in the United States during the Great Depression. Ukrainians complained they could not afford food. Much of the economy had been tied to the Soviet military, as suppliers and purveyors of the military, and that was all gone. Privatization of the government-owned businesses, because remember, in the Soviet Union, it was state-owned for major, most of the large enterprises. They were turned into capitalist organizations, but the oligarchs, you're all familiar now with the oligarchs and their yachts and whatnot, basically took control and the profits from these operations. President Kuchma, who had been a communist leader in Ukraine, kind of leaned right, but used many similar tactics to those of the former Soviet leaders. Okay? A political challenger died mysteriously in a car crash. A journalist who was exposing corruption in Kuchma's government was found beheaded in a forest outside of Kyiv. Okay, so this is tough stuff. So, presidential election in 2004. Viktor Yushchenko, a reformed prime minister, ran for president. In opposition was Viktor Yanukovych, who was supported by Vladimir Putin, who had taken over from Yeltsin in 2000. So Putin's now the president of Russia, right? Yushchenko was in the lead. All the polls had him way, not the polls, P-O-L-L-S, political polls, had him way in the lead. He suddenly falls violently ill, okay? And it turns out he was poisoned. and by dioxin, which was essentially, it was made in Russia. Okay, it was a Russian military thing. He eventually does recover, and he runs again against Yanukovych, and he's again way in the lead in the polls, but when the votes were announced, they said Yanukovych won by a fairly good margin. Of course, the people went crazy, and you've heard of the Orange Revolution. This is the Orange Revolution. People take to the streets, okay? They take to Maidan, which is Independence Square, and eventually they hold another election, and Yushchenko was announced the victor. Okay, the Russian-Ukrainian War, 2022.
Did you cover the 1994 treaty where they're...
About to. Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. So the source for these slides was NPR, which I got online, and the article was Russia's at war with Ukraine, here's how we got here. And it's basically a timeline. The thing I like about NPR is, one, you can believe them. Two, they do it in a very approachable manner. Okay, so this is reported Becky Sullivan's work. Okay, so I'm telling you, and I'm just the presenter here on this. Okay, so the Budapest Memorandum, which you just had mentioned, but first we're going to talk about NATO. 1992, Allies contemplate adding Central and Eastern European neighbors for the first time to NATO. Ukraine formally establishes relationships, but doesn't join NATO. And NATO's Secretary General visits Kyiv, and Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk visits NATO headquarters in Brussels. Now, 1994. There was actually an article about this today in the Boston Globe, if you saw it. 1994, after the Soviet Union collapses, Ukraine is left with the world's third largest nuclear stockpile. In a treaty called the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agrees to trade away its intercontinental ballistic missiles, its warheads, and other nuclear infrastructure in exchange for guarantees that the three other treaty signatories, the US, the UK, and Russia, okay, will respect independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, okay? The article is actually, today in the Globe, I'm thinking about, was about Korea, South Korea, who's contemplating becoming a nuclear power, and they're saying, well, should we really do this? Look, this wouldn't have happened to Ukraine if they kept their nuclear weapons. So leaning towards the West and Russia's response. January 2005, Yushchenko takes office as president with Julia Tymoshenko as prime minister. 2008, following efforts by Yushchenko and Tymoshenko to bring Ukraine into NATO, the two formally request in January that Ukraine be granted a membership action plan, which is the first step in joining NATO. In April, George W. Bush supports Ukraine's membership, but France and Germany don't, because they don't want to make Russia mad because of oil and gas, right? Okay. In April, NATO responds with a compromise, says it promises that Ukraine one day will be a member of the alliance, but does not put it on a specific path for how to do so, in other words, how to join. January 1st, Gazprom, which is a state-owned Russian gas company, suddenly stops pumping natural gas to Ukraine following months of politically fraught negotiations over gas prices. We're talking natural gas here. Because Eastern and Central European countries rely on pipelines through Ukraine to receive gas imports from Russia, there's a crisis. okay? Quickly, it goes beyond Ukraine's borders into Europe. Under international pressure to resolve the crisis, Tymoshenko negotiates a new deal with Putin, and gas flows beginning January 20th, and much of Europe still relies, of course, as we know very well, on gas and oil from Russia today. Yanukovych. So in 2010, Yanukovych is elected president in February. He says Ukraine should be a neutral state cooperating with both Russia and Western allies like NATO. 2011, Ukrainian prosecutors opened up criminal investigations into Tymoshenko, alleging corruption and misuse of government resources. In October, a court finds her guilty of abuse of power during the 2009 negotiations with Russia over the gas crisis and sentences her to 7 years in prison, prompting concerns in the West that Ukrainian leaders are persecuting political opponents. So here she's sent off to prison for 7 years because she's an opposition candidate to Yanukovych. 2014, the Maidan Revolution. So just days before it's to be signed, this is with an agreement with the European Union, Yanukovych announces that he will refuse to sign an association agreement with the European Union to bring Ukraine into a free trade agreement. He cites pressure from Russia. The announcement sparks huge protests across Ukraine, the largest since the Orange Revolution, calling for Yanukovych to resign. Protesters camping out in Kiev's Maidan Square, also known as Independence Square, occupied government buildings, including Kiev's City Hall and Justice Ministry. In late February, the police are brought in, violence erupts, and 100 civilians are killed in the single bloodiest week in the post-Soviet historic period. Ahead of the scheduled impeachment vote on February 22nd of Yanukovych, he flees, arriving in Russia, and Parliament goes on to unanimously remove Yanukovych and install an interim government, and they also vote to free Tymoshenko from prison. The new government charges Yanukovych with mass murder of the Maidan protesters and issues a warrant for his arrest. Russia declares that the change in Ukraine government is illegal. Almost immediately, armed men appear at the checkpoints and facilities in the Crimean peninsula. Putin at first denies they are Russian soldiers, but then later admits it. Okay. Crimea. With Russian troops in control of the peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula votes to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. A public referendum follows with 97% of the voters favoring secession, though people question the results. Putin finalizes the Russian annexation of Crimea in a March 18th announcement to Russia's parliament. In response, the U.S. and allies in Europe impose sanctions on Russia. They have never recognized Russia's annexation, and it's the only time since World War II that a European nation had used military force to seize a territory. April 2014, 40,000 Russian troops gathered on Ukraine's eastern border. Violence breaks out in eastern Ukraine region of Donbass. Russian-supported separatists forces storm government buildings into two eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. They declare independence from Ukraine as Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, though they remain internationally recognized as part of Ukraine. Putin just said officially, I think it was this week, right, that no, they're independent countries. He reiterated that. Russia denies that its troops are on Ukrainian soil. Of course, now that's passed. Okay. May 2014, attempts at peace. The pro-West politician Petro Poroshenko, a former government minister in the Council of the National Bank of Ukraine, is elected Ukraine's president. He promotes reforms, including measures to address corruption and lessen Ukraine's dependence on Russian energy and financial support. On September 5th, representatives from Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany meet in Belarus in an attempt to negotiate an end to the violence in Donbass. It's called the Minsk Agreement, and a deal between Ukraine and Russia to quiet violence under a fragile ceasefire, but it breaks down, violence continues. February 2015, they meet again, resulting in the Minsk II agreement, but it's been unsuccessful. And between 2014 and January of 2021, 14,000 people have been killed and tens of thousands wounded and millions displaced in the Donbass region. Together, the annexation of Crimea and Russian-backed violence in the east have pushed Ukrainian public sentiment towards the west, strengthening interest in joining NATO and the EU. 16 and 17. As fighting in Donbass continues, Russia repeatedly strikes at Ukraine in a series of cyber attacks, including 2016 on Kiev's power grid that causes a major blackout, and then a large-scale assault affects key Ukrainian infrastructure, including National Bank of Ukraine and the country's electrical grid. Cyber attacks from Russia have continued through the present, the last major attack on government websites in January 2022. I think this is maybe, and this is my opinion really, that's part of the concern of the United States and the West really becoming too aggressive or entering more into the war as they're afraid of cyber attacks. We can cyber attack them, they can certainly cyber attack us. It's a huge problem. In April, comedian and actor Vladimir Zelensky is elected president. Interestingly enough, he's a young man. He's also Jewish, which is really pretty neat, considering the history of Jews in Ukraine. In a landslide rebuke of Poroshenko and the status quo, which includes a stagnating economy and conflict with Russia. During his campaign, Zelensky vowed to make peace with Russia and end the war in Donbass. His early efforts to reach a solution to the violence are slowed by the United States President Donald Trump, who briefly blocks U.S. military aid to Ukraine, suggests that Zelensky should instead work with Putin to resolve the crisis. And a phone call, we know about the phone call, the can you do me a favor phone call to go after the Biden family. And of course it leads to Trump's first impeachment in December of 2019. Several U.S. officials later testified that Zelensky was close to actually announcing an investigation, though he ultimately demurs, saying Ukrainians are tired of Burisma, which was the company that was in question. We're almost there, and we can talk. Okay, 2021, the crisis escalates. April, about 100,000 troops, Russia sends 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border for military exercises. Zelensky urges NATO leadership to put Ukraine on a timeline for membership later that month. Russia says it will withdraw its troops, but tens of thousands remain. In August, after the entanglement with Trump, Zelensky visits the White House to meet with President Biden. Biden emphasizes the U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression, but says they're not yet ready to join NATO. Remember, Putin kept on saying if they agree they won't join NATO, then we'll withdraw, right? That's what he was saying. Russia renews its troops' presence near the Ukrainian border, alarming U.S. intelligence officials who travel to Brussels to brief NATO allies. And Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says, we're not really sure what he's up to, but basically they've got our attention. Biden, speaking with Putin in December, urges him not to invade Ukraine, or it's going to be real costs for Russia. And Putin issues a contentious set of security demands. Among them, he asks NATO to permanently bar Ukraine from membership and for NATO to withdraw forces stationed in countries that joined the alliance after 1997, including Romania and the Balkan countries. Putin demands a written response from the United States and NATO. January, so we're essentially here. Leaders and diplomats from the US and European countries meet repeatedly to try to avoid the crisis. Russian Deputy Minister Sergei Rybakov says, we're not going to attack Ukraine. The State Department orders the families of embassy staff to leave, and Biden sends 8,500 troops, puts them on ready to be deployed to Poland. Representatives of the US and NATO deliver their written responses to Putin's demands on January 26th. In responses, officials say they cannot bar Ukraine from joining NATO, but they're willing to talk about arms control. In February, okay, well, we all know what happens in February. They bring in more troops. The United States sends in more troops. And on February 21st, this is important in the middle. In mid-February, the fighting escalates between Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian forces in the two eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Separatist leaders call for evacuations. In our view, what is happening in Donbass today is, in fact, genocide, says Putin. So there are these separatists, Russian separatists, that are in eastern Ukraine, and they're saying, we're being attacked by the Ukrainians, and it's genocide, they're killing us. So this is giving Putin, what does that sound like? Sudetenland, right? In World War II, Hitler says, those poor Germans, they're being attacked by, Czechs, we've got to go in there and save them. It's an excuse. Putin formally recognizes the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. And in response, Biden declares the move the beginning of the Russian invasion. And together, the US and Ukraine and the European Union enact a set of sanctions targeting Russian banks and oligarchs. I think that's it. And of course, the 24th. Whew. Yeah.